I'm sorry, I'm in your way here.
Just a little bit. Okay, that's better.
Today we'll be talking about chapter 30, section 4, titled 1968, A Tumultuous Year. We're dealing with an enemy attack in Vietnam known as the Tet Offensive, 2 assassinations, MLK, Robert Kennedy, among others, as well as a chaotic Democratic primary convention, the famous 1968 Democratic Convention riots that we'll be looking at in just a little bit. So it was a very odd year, and it proved to be a turning point in the war in Vietnam, maybe not from a military standpoint, but certainly from a political one. So first off, the Tet Offensive. Every year, throughout the course of the Vietnam War, at the end of January, the Vietnamese celebrated their new year. It was a custom for the North Vietnamese as well as the Viet Cong to cease hostilities during that time. Soldiers knew it was a safe time to go on furlough and visit their families. Bases would go to low alert, and it was just generally understood this was an okay time to relax. And then in 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese launched a coordinated strike on over 100 South Vietnamese towns. The cause of this, what you see on 1C, the cause was the crowd contained Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops and launched attacks on over 100 towns. The effect of this, the 1E on your notes, was that General Westmoreland declared the attacks a military defeat. In fact, we had the situation under control in less than a month. Not bad for putting down an insurrection. Yet the political ramifications of this were paramount. Because the year of this attack was 1968. The United States sent troops to Vietnam in 1964. 4 years of fighting, tens of thousands of American soldiers dead, and yet still the Viet Cong were capable of such a well-planned and coordinated strike. And South Vietnam erupted in chaos for over a month. In fact, I've got some real footage from the Tet Offensive to show you.
No, wait. Yeah, we all got messed up.
Wait, how did it work?
New war. The Viet Cong simultaneously attacked just about every major city and town in South Vietnam. In one day, they increased the scope of the war dramatically. Howard Tuckner was there.
The war came to Saigon early in the morning of January 31st. The first target was the symbol of the American presence in Vietnam, the United States Embassy. About 20 Viet Cong had invaded the embassy compound and were now battling American Marines and military police. The Viet Cong had penetrated to the center of what was supposed to be the most secure city in Vietnam.
On the 5th day of the battle for Hue, the Marines moved out from the fortified Army compound that withstood the original attack and advanced into the empty, abandoned buildings of what was Hue University. Hue, the ancient imperial city. It is to Vietnamese what Old Boston is to Americans, where many of its country's leaders are born or educated, where many returned to celebrate Tet a week ago when the fighting began, where many remain hidden in the unknown interior of...
What's the hardest part of it? Not knowing where they are, that's the worst thing. Riding around and running the sewers and the gutters anywhere. Be anywhere. Just hope you can stay alive from day to day. Everybody just wants to go back home and go to school. That's about it.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, really.
For days now, they've been fighting their way, bloody inch by inch, down Le Loi Street. And all that time, they could see, down the street, a flagpole, and on it was a Viet Cong flag. Much is left in shambles. As the Marines advance, building after building, the North Vietnamese retreat, building after building, giving up nothing without a fight. Still going on, just a few yards away, Marines have risked their lives to pull down this symbol. No one is quite sure where the American flag came from in the middle of a battle. Like so many things, when you need something, someone just happens to have it. There was no bugler, and the other Marines were too busy to salute, but not often is a flag so proudly raised.
All right, give me this, then.
Yeah, that's what gets me.
That's not the way we thought this.
We're supposed to be hard chargers, man. We're supposed to go out and get them. I think if they pull a good search and destroy up here, we could clear them out.
Well, I don't know. You get out there 50 feet and you're lost already in the jungle. I mean, it looks pretty clear from here.
It's just a constant siege here, and you don't know exactly when the incoming's coming, and you don't know how much it's going to be from day to day. And
how would you compare it to other places that you've served in Vietnam?
Well, this is the worst I've been at. You just most of the time you can't get anything done because there's too much incoming. You can't get out much at all. It's just too dangerous to get out. And
And you see, Tet Offensive changed public opinion. Before Tet, most Americans considered themselves hawks, meaning they supported an expansion of the war. After Tet, most Americans considered themselves doves. It was a profound effect on public opinion. Because once again, 4 years into the war, throughout the entire war, the military was promising that we were winning this thing. And now the enemy would manage to pin us down for over a month. Caused complete chaos throughout the country of Vietnam. And the mainstream media began to openly criticize this war. Meanwhile, Johnson appointed a new Secretary of Defense, as I told you before. The previous one, Robert McNamara, resigned. And the new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, studied the war and concluded that this was an unwinnable conflict. That without resorting to total war tactics and nuclear warheads, we could not end this war. Meanwhile, Johnson's popularity continued to drop. 60% of Americans disapproved of his handling of the war itself. Meanwhile, the presidential election of 1968, the famous one that this often gets compared to. Senator Eugene McCarthy ran for the Democratic nomination as a dove, meaning he promised that if elected, he would seek an immediate end to the war in Vietnam. Running against him was Senator Robert Kennedy, brother to former President John F. Kennedy. Decided to enter the race after Johnson's poor showing in New Hampshire, one of the first states to report in the primaries. Johnson, the incumbent president, received such a low level of support in New Hampshire that he decided to not seek a re-election. One of the only incumbent presidents to not seek re-election. In fact, he is the only one who did not seek re-election as a result of a poor showing in the primaries. In fact, commonly they don't even have primaries for when there's an incumbent president. There was no Democratic primary in 2012. There rarely is. Yet Johnson's popularity was so low the Democratic Party was pursuing other options. And it became clear that Johnson was not going to be chosen to run for re-election. Spring of this same year, Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee. As I've told you previously, there were riots in over 100 American cities in response to his death. Robert Kennedy, the very man who spoke at Martin Luther King's funeral, who gave us that great speech titled The Mindless Menace of Violence in Society, a great statesman who worked for peace in Vietnam and peace at home, was shot and killed by a Jordanian immigrant because of Kennedy's unwavering support of the State of Israel. These two deaths led to riots throughout American history, demonstrations on college campuses, and generally the late 1960s were a very disruptive time in our country, both because of the unpopular war in Vietnam, coupled with the racial tensions and economic troubles in our country, and the changing culture and many other things led to a great period of unrest. Now this summer we're going to get to see the Republican and Democratic national conventions, something that happens at the conclusion of every presidential primary, where the delegates, representatives from each state of both parties, will meet at separate conventions to determine who the next candidate for president is going to be. So it's an exciting event. It happens in June of every election year. Now, in 1968, the election was rather chaotic. Eugene McCarthy running promising peace versus Robert Kennedy, who was winning the election, and upon accepting the nomination for president, he was shot and killed. Well, that doesn't often happen. Teddy Roosevelt was shot during a campaign, but he didn't die. In fact, Robert Kennedy is, to my knowledge, the only candidate that was shot and killed during a primary race. Now, eventually, Vice President Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic nomination for president versus Eugene McCarthy, the further left, pro-peace, anti-war candidate. Now, what I'm about to show you are scenes from the riot at the 1968 Democratic Convention. I want you to listen to what people were chanting and watch how the police reacted as protesters tried to force their way into the convention. They felt the Democratic Party had been so corrupt throughout this campaign, and Hubert Humphrey did not represent their interests to the point that some Democrats became violent, showing up at the convention and attempting to force their way in to change the decision of the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, inside this convention, a bunch of freaked out delegates who were surrounded by the National Guard were attempting to debate what position they should take on the war. And eventually the outcome was that the delegates decided they were going to adopt an anti-war plank, meaning they eventually decided that the Democratic Party was going to represent the peace ticket on the 1968 election.
Bad place to be in.
Open them up. There it goes. The victory is ours! The victory is ours! The victory is ours! Get in here!
So meanwhile, Richard Nixon was the candidate for president on the Republican side in 1968. He promised to restore law and order in the United States as well as end the war in Vietnam. He called it peace with honor, and we'll get to that tomorrow. Though it didn't work out that way, that's what he promised the American people. There was a third candidate running in the 1968 election. Maybe you remember George Wallace, the famous governor who stood in front of the University of Alabama to bar black students from entering. So that wacko decided he was going to run for president. And then somebody shot him. And that ended his candidacy. So he didn't die, but he was generally hated by many as a sign of the racial tensions and bigotry that was so prevalent in southern states and in other parts of the country as well. Richard Nixon won the presidency, and we'll continue his story at a later time.